안녕하십니까. 미실리콘밸리에서 생생하고 가치 있는 정보를 배달해드리는 더밀크 손정원입니다. 오늘은 코리아투 글로벌을 주제로 밸리토크 시즌 3를 시작합니다. 기생충, BTS, 오징어 게임 등의 현상이 2020년, 2021년에 나왔었는데요. 이것이 일시적인 현상이 아니라 지속적인 코리안 소프트 파워를 갖추기 위해서 앞으로 어떻게 해야 하는지에 대한 아이디어를 밸리토크 시즌 3에서 제공해 드릴 것입니다. 오늘은 그 첫 번째 인터뷰로 팀황, 피스컬노트 창업자와 CEO 인터뷰를 했습니다. 코리안 아메리칸인 팀황 CEO는 프린스턴대를 나온 인재죠. 그리고 실리콘밸리에서 법률 리걸 테크 회사 피스컬노트를 창업해서 상장까지 이뤄냈습니다. 또 한국인 커뮤니티에 대한 많은 애정으로 활동을 하고 있습니다. 오늘 팀황 CEO와 함께 코리아투 글로벌에 대한 아이디어를 얻으시기 바랍니다.
Sure. My name is Tim Huang, founder and CEO at FiscalNote. So we were actually looking at a bunch of different options as a company. So for most kind of pre-IPO late stage companies right now, they're probably looking at sort of three different options. So the first option is to continue to stay private by raising incremental venture capital or private equity.
Sure.
The second approach is to do kind of a traditional IPO. And the third approach is to think about going public via SPAC. Now, each of these pathways have different plus and minuses, if you will, as you're evaluating different strategies. And we were really thinking about going public for a lot of different reasons. We wanted to access the public markets. We wanted to be able to use our stock as an opportunity for further M&A, for further acquisitions. And so when we were looking at the two different options for IPO versus SPAC, we actually went down both pathways at the same time. And we ended up going and choosing the SPAC process because of the partner that we ended up partnering with. So our SPAC is very, very, very unique. It's very hard to find a similar SPAC in the marketplace where they're effectively backstopping and guaranteeing the full amount of the SPAC cash in the current company. They're also anchoring another capital raise on top of the SPAC process and supporting effectively the company through that entire phase, right? So a lot of the SPAC market right now, there's a lot of uncertainty around whether or not the deal will get done, whether the vote will happen, so on and so forth. But in our particular case, our sponsor, which is a large asset manager and hedge fund out in Asia, has agreed to essentially fully underwrite and ensure that the deal gets done. And so that's a very, very hard commitment to find, even in an IPO process. And that was very compelling for us as we were going into the marketplace. Well, I think it's two things. The first thing is we want to keep growing our business in what I call these regulated sectors of the future. So these are areas where we expect laws and regulations and politics to be significantly more complex. And a lot of that really comes down to thinking about what governments are doing right now, right? So if you open up the newspaper and you see, the issues that governments care about, there are things like data privacy, ESG, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, cryptocurrencies, where there's a significant level of regulations coming down the line. So our strategy right now is to continue to build new products, new data sets, new services that essentially enable our customers to be able to get a better sense for how these laws and regulations are changing. The second is, to continue our strategy of M&A. We've been a very active M&A participant, acquiring a number of different companies, expanding the scope of our products. And so, this kind of goes back in line with what I was saying before about FiscalNote's strategy to grow into these new regulated sectors in the future and identify additional acquisition opportunities that will basically help us grow both in these new industries, but also new geographies in places like Europe, Latin America, and Asia, where we see a lot of growth in the future. So we have a couple different products that service the ESG market. We have some data sets that essentially help companies to understand what governments and lawmakers and regulators are saying about their requirements with respect to carbon emissions or new environmental standards. We've essentially packaged all this data to help these organizations navigate a number of new kind of regulatory or legal changes that are happening. We also have a product called Equilibrium, which is our carbon accounting and sustainability reporting platform, which essentially helps companies to collect all of their internal data around ESG within their company, and then create automatic reports that go out to investors, the public, to government regulators and policymakers, and really help them to sort of streamline the process of accountability and data analytics with respect to ESG. So in order for companies to hit their ESG goals and targets, we have to help them essentially to build these software capabilities that collect information from across the firm. And that's something that, we're very, very committed to doing. And so that's actually, a very, very kind of exciting and fast growing part of our business today.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. That your ESG phenomenon is a good opportunity you growth at, I think. And also I'd like to, move to another question. Like Pi스컬노트 was founded in Sunnyvale, right? In Silicon Valley. And then when I went to Plug and Play last week, and then your company was on the wall, was Pi스컬노트. Yeah, but it was. Yeah, I knew that, but after they are and Plug and Play, they are proud of you guys go to the the New York Stock Exchange, and I noticed that as next to the Airbnb or something like good companies. And
well, I started off my career actually in politics and government. So I never thought that I would be a tech founder, a tech entrepreneur. One of my first jobs was working for Senator Obama when he was working, essentially running for president. I worked in a number of different kind of political contexts and campaigns. And ultimately, I think, a lot of the reason why people get into politics is because they want to make a difference and want to make a change. And I think that, in the early part of my career, I realized that it's very hard to make a big difference in politics. It takes a very long amount of time. And honestly, it's just very frustrating given the current political climate. And so, I was looking around and I saw the technology industry that was just rapidly changing, rapidly impacting people's lives and creating massive amounts of impact on a very, very fast amount of time. And so I think that I almost did kind of almost a 180 in thinking about, how can I apply my expertise into the kind of technology realm. And initially I thought maybe, I could be a lawyer or kind of go back into the government and work on technology laws and regulations. But ultimately, I decided to kind of switch completely into getting a kind of computer science and technical background, and then trying to build a company at the intersection of those two interests. And back in 2013, 2014, when we were founding this company, I was really thinking about what are the biggest challenges that our society faces around the interactions with government. And fundamentally, what it came down to is information. A lot of people are unaware of what government is doing, how it impacts them, what the implications of those laws and regulations are. And we wanted to essentially build a company that provided a lot of the transparency and a lot of the insights into, what those governments are working on at any given time. And so that ultimately was the main driver of our business when we first started the company. And to this day, we actually have not really changed our mission. Our product is, our set of products are pretty much the same in terms of the opportunities that we see. We just see a bigger and broader opportunity globally and in new markets. But fundamentally, what we're doing is we're collecting government data and providing it for people. And that really has been the starting vision and mission of why I started the company in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really unique business model, and also the unique idea to, as a legal tech regulation part is normally, the lawyers and that kind of things do, but you want to focusing on the data, and also as a data company and tech company, that's really unique. And
yeah, honestly, I don't know if they're interesting, I guess, but when we founded the company, we were just three guys, a laptop, and an idea, and so we initially built the product, and we're trying to get customers and things like that. And when we were raising our first round of capital, actually, we ended up cold emailing Mark Cuban. So I found his email on Google, literally just copied and pasted his email address, and then just went out there and asked Mark, hey, is this something that you're interested in? And Mark, shot an email back within an hour, and he was our first investor. From there, we brought on, to your point, Jerry Yang, co-founder of Yahoo, and other great investment firms like NEA, which is a very large venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. And I think we're very lucky to have some great investors from the beginning who have really supported the company, supported our mission and our vision. And, I don't know if there's any secret. I mean, I think we're just a bunch of really hardworking, smart guys that, had a really interesting idea. And that's something that I think is, maybe we got lucky, but it's something that we definitely had an opportunity to kind of grow in over the last couple of years or so. Yeah, I think that first and foremost, it's a very humbling experience to be, on the pathway to becoming a public company CEO, and to be one that's Asian American. And the way I think about it is this opportunity was really, paved through by a lot of other folks who kind of came before us in terms of other CEOs that have really done really well and taken their companies public and performed extremely well in the markets. I do think that from my perspective, there's definitely a lack of Asian American representation in all levels of society, in media and in politics and in business and in other kind of, important places that we really want kind of broader representation in. And, being an Asian American in the US in particular is very hard. I mean, you're definitely in the minority. You have a much smaller community of supported individuals. I think you have to work a little bit harder to prove, that you're capable of doing the job. And, more specifically being Korean American, I think, I think a lot about my personal roots in being both Korean and American. And, to be honest, when I was younger, I thought that actually being Korean American was a disadvantage for some reason, because of the lack of community or lack of support and all these different things. But I actually think in the last couple of years, as I've kind of built this company and started to scale it up, that being Korean American and being Asian American is a huge advantage, particularly in new growth markets where you have a significant advantage in terms of understanding culture, building business relationships, understanding the language and the background and history of both US and Korea. That's a huge advantage in terms of business opportunities and partnerships and M&A and investment and everything else. And I think the second thing is that, when you think about sort of the unique place of Korean American founders and entrepreneurs and investors, there's a very big opportunity to, I think, bridge a lot of gaps between the two countries and, figure out a way in which we can leverage our platform for, more kind of closer ties and bigger opportunities. And it's telling actually, over the course of the last couple of years, I know everyone talks about this, but the sort of second wave of the Korean kind of media and content industry, Korea is like the base of innovation in Asia. You've got, entertainment and content and media and metaverse and cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence and, major innovations in autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles and everything else. I think that the cutting edge of being able to combine, technologists and business entrepreneurs and the like between the two countries is quite significant and something that I'm hopeful that we can try and push forward in the future. Well, I think it's obvious, right? I mean, you look at Netflix or BTS or just any late night TV show or whatnot, and you see, I think it's very surprising
Yeah,
to see Korean faces for the first time. But it's actually interestingly not just in entertainment, but on Wall Street, we have the kind of new CEOs of KKR and Carlyle, both Korean American. You have a number of members of Congress that are also Korean American that are representing themselves. I think you see that in sports and media and entertainment and politics and business. So it's actually, I think, a really exciting time to be Korean American. I think a lot of it comes down to understanding your identity and being able to leverage that identity for its advantages. And when I speak to a lot of Korean founders or Korean American founders, a lot of them kind of struggle with that opportunity. It might be a Korean founder who's trying to build their business to be global into the future, or a Korean American founder that's trying to bridge the gap between kind of Korean business opportunities and American business opportunities. And a lot of it, I think, just comes down to figuring out how to leverage that opportunity in general. So in maybe even just 5 to 7 years ago, the prevailing advice among investors and other founders was that if you're a Korean founder, that you should try and be global first and Korean second. And that was sort of the number one piece of advice that people would give at the time. I think that the advice is probably flipped now, particularly in places like entertainment and media and content and metaverse components, where the unique Koreanness of a particular product or service or company is increasingly seen as an advantage. And so leaning into that opportunity, while being aware of the kind of global market opportunity, is something that I think is a unique shift that's happening in the technology industry. Well, I think that it's a lot of different things. So the first thing I think is that the commitment to quality, and I think the Korean market has always been committed to high quality content, highly creative information, so on and so forth. Things are very differentiated and unique. And that's something that I think is very difficult to find in a more globalized society. So, in the last 10 years or so, we've seen the proliferation of social media, the expansion of the internet that's essentially enabled us to have a much better understanding of global cultures and contexts. And, within that context, you see, emerging opportunities for countries like Korea to really differentiate the products and services and content and information that they have overall. And so, in my opinion, I mean, and maybe I'm biased, but Korean people have always been hardworking, innovative, creative,
Sure.
And highly differentiated in the marketplace. And for a lot of different reasons, they haven't been able to break out of see breakout trends, especially. But in the new era of kind of permanent information on the internet, through platforms like streaming or Spotify or other things, these things essentially have major distribution mechanisms for high quality information and content to compete and rise to the top. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of that success today. Well, I think that right now we're entering into a phase in the technology industry where you're seeing the digitalization of everything. And it's not just in legal, but it's in healthcare and real estate and energy and travel, and I mean literally financial services. Like every single sector you can think of is being digitized. And so the one thing that I would say is that people should really focus on business opportunities that they feel passionate about. And I know that it's a very cliche thing to say, but running a startup is very hard. And there's enough opportunities in multiple different markets and industries where you really have to be passionate about something that you're working on, and to be able to build that into the future. I also think that the markets today are more globalized than ever, and to that extent, thinking about global distribution and global opportunity is something that should obviously come first. And the Korean market is great by in and of itself, but to be honest, the growth of BTS and Squid Games and parasites and others, happen through kind of global distribution mechanisms as opposed to domestic distribution mechanisms. And so, thinking about how to distribute a product globally is something that I think Korean founders in particular uniquely think about on a constant basis. And it's something that needs to be kind of front and center in terms of business opportunities. I think that on top of that, being able to kind of leverage the unique Korean characteristics of a particular business, to be able to really kind of lean into those opportunities, I think is really important, right? So as an example, there's a number of new companies in the metaverse and virtual reality and augmented reality. It's one thing to try and compete against American or European or Chinese startups in those contexts, but if you are a VR company in the Korean market today, I think that's a massive advantage. You have close proximity to global IP that people are basically scrambling to find. You have a home field advantage, when it comes to sort of building out the unique characteristics and defensibility. And so identifying where those opportunities are, I think are really, really important. I know that there's a lot of great founders who I know are constantly thinking about this stuff, on a regular basis. I think that every country has its own regulatory culture, with respect to how, kind of people approach different things. So as an example, the United States has, I would say, a negative, not in terms of like bad, but negative regulatory culture, which means that they basically say, here are the things you cannot do. And then, outside of those things, it's sort of gray area, right?
Sure.
The Korean kind of regulatory landscape, I would say, has sort of a more positive kind of regulatory culture, which basically means that here are the things you cannot, here are the things you can do, and then everything outside of that, you're not allowed to do. So I think that because of the way in which politics and regulations have kind of evolved in each country, that does create sort of entrepreneurial or innovation obstacles in its own different context, right? So in the American context, for instance, because there's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of question marks that people have. Am I allowed to do this or not? And what that results in is actually, in often cases, the US system is so complex because you have a central government in DC, and then you have 50 independent federal or state governments that have their own laws and regulations. And in some cases, city governments who have their own regulations as well. And sometimes those regulations actually are not in compliance with each other, right? So a good example of this in the US is cannabis. So the marijuana industry, which is growing very, very rapidly. The federal government to this day still maintains its federal kind of drug policy, whereas kind of individual states, have created their own policies, and those policies are basically opposites of each other, right? And so there's a lot of question marks that happen that have to get resolved, and the process is very messy in the United States. I would say Korea has a much more centralized system, and again, because of its more positive aspects, there's a lot more clear lines of what's allowed and what's not allowed. But that also means that, there's a lot more of a need for innovators to push the boundaries of laws and regulations constantly in order to actually allow things that are not currently allowed. And so it's a very different type of culture, I would say. The Korean culture, you might get a lot more clarity, but you might sacrifice some innovation. Whereas in the US, you might get a lot less clarity, but you'll get a lot more innovation. So it's just a very different context. And I will say that there's a lot of different reasons why that's the case, because of politics and culture and history and philosophy and everything else. But ultimately, I wouldn't say one system is better than the other, just that they're very different, for innovators. And, ultimately founders and entrepreneurs are going to find ways to continue to push the boundaries in both contexts to build their businesses. seems right now that we are almost in sort of a hurricane of innovation in basically every single industry. And it's happening at the same time. So, whether it's in mobility or in financial services or in information or data analytics or metaverse or whatever it is, there's just so many things that are happening that are changing at any given time. And a lot of it really just comes down to, really identifying the things that will make our lives better and things that will improve kind of the standing of individuals and society in general. I think at FiscalNote, a lot of the mission that we have as a company is to really provide information and transparency and government policies to the world and be able to collect every law and every regulation in every country on the planet and digitize that and make it available for people to be able to understand what governments are doing and the impacts of those laws and regulations on people. We view our kind of mission as inherently good and very important in this context of the hurricane of changes that are going on. But I think, as an individual citizen or somebody who kind of sits in this type of environment, one thing that I would note is that the interactions between governments and technologists and the people are increasingly more and more tenuous. And it requires a very active citizenry to understand what their preferences are, right? So around things like data privacy, right? How willing are you to allow technology companies and regulators working together to leverage your data and information for their business practices? There's no right or wrong answer. It's just a philosophical question that people need to be very aware of. Another question might be, how willing are you to test the boundaries of autonomous vehicles, in testing on real world situations and the like, and how ready is the world for that? And I think that people are going to have to make political and decisions based off that information. Or things like cryptocurrencies, right? What's the extent of what you think that regulators should do to regulate the cryptocurrency industry, and it will be regulated. So the questions, those are kind of key political questions that I think, not just technologists, but the sort of general public needs to think about. And I think that's something that we're very excited to be a part of here at FiscalNote, but something that I think about individually as well.
Thank you for the really precious interview. I think.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that for sure.
Yeah, really. 어떠셨습니까? 팀황 피스컬노트 CEO가 와우, 혁신의 허리케인식이다. 그리고 코리아 디스카운트, 코리아 디스어드밴티지가 아니라 이제는 코리아 어드밴테이지 시대가 온다고 얘기를 했습니다. 모두가 지금 2022년 큰 꿈을 꾸고 글로벌 무대로 진출하는데 두려움이 없는 해가 되시길 바랍니다. 감사합니다.